Let's talk about symptoms of vitamin B5 deficiency. Now, one of the symptoms is a physical symptom, not on the list here, and that's premature graying of the hair. So if you 20 years old and your hair is turning gray, this can be, and there are other things certainly that can cause gray hair, but I want to be clear that premature graying of the hair is a hallmark kind of classic symptom of severe vitamin B5 deficiency. And its nickname, actually, if we go back to, what do we call vitamin B5? We said pantothenate, pantothenic acid, pantethine, but its nickname originally, it was when this vitamin was originally discovered, it was discovered by the famed biochemist Roger Williams, who called it the let's use a different marker here. I'm running out of juice. The anti-graying factor. Okay, it was also called the anti-stress factor. And so what this scientist discovered is, and the studies were done in mice originally, so what was discovered is that when mice were deprived of this substance, of this B5 substance, then their brown coats would turn gray. And if you reintroduced B5 back into their diet, then their brown or their gray coats would turn back brown. So that's why it was originally kind of classed out as the anti-graying factor, the anti-stress factors. Also anti-stress factor because remember, part of what we need to produce cortisol is vitamin B5, and cortisol is one of our anti-stress hormones. And so this goes back to why it's also called the anti-stress factor. We actually know that, the studies in animals are very, very clear on this, that if you give animals extra vitamin B5, what happens is their ability to produce cortisol actually increases. So think of this in terms of humans. Now, I know you can't just directly extrapolate mice studies or animal studies to humans, but a number of doctors like myself, including myself, have seen this play out time and time again, where people are under extreme chronic inflammatory stress. And one of the scenarios here is when they've been on long-term steroids. So those of you who've had long-term steroid use, a lot of times, depending on your dose and depending on how much, but when you're on long-term steroids, one of the side effects of that is it will reduce your body's natural ability to produce your own cortisol. Because remember what those long-term steroids are. They're corticosteroids. We're not talking about long-term steroids like testosterone. We're talking about long-term steroids like corticosteroids. And over time, they actually can shrink your own adrenal glands or atrophy your own adrenal glands, leaving you with less of an ability to produce your own cortisol. And so think of who's on a long-term steroid. Commonly what I've seen, people with asthma inhalers, people with chronic pain and chronic inflammation, intermittent steroids, people with traumatic injuries or traumas where you've had steroid injections or things of that nature multiple times to get the injury under control. So these are some of your main reasons, but also a lot of you that might suffer with skin inflammation like psoriasis or skin inflammation, eczema, one of those that usually have a cause. Now, trauma, not so much, it helps you fight off inflammation in a natural way. So it's important. Going off topic here, I was talking about the anti-stress factor, but this is one of the reasons why, is that you need vitamin B5 to make your own cortisol. But if you're taking external versions of corticosteroids over time, you reduce your body's capacity to produce its own cortisol. And I have seen cases, a number of cases, where people were in this scenario and higher doses of vitamin B5 were extremely helpful at helping them dig themselves out of that hole where their adrenal glands were in a fatigued mode. And I know a lot of mainstream medicine, mainstream medical docs will say there's no such thing as adrenal fatigue unless you have not Graves' disease, but Addison's disease, which is a form of autoimmune adrenal gland fatigue. But unless you have Addison's, there's no such thing as adrenal fatigue. When again, a number of us in the functional realm who see people on a regular basis see adrenal fatigue quite commonly. And one of the ways that you can ask your doctor to measure your cortisol output. So this is just kind of a side note here. You can test what's called and I would recommend, it's a simple test. It's a 4-point cortisol. So they measure your cortisol output at different times of the day, typically morning, noon, afternoon, and nighttime. That's why it's called a 4-point cortisol. You should also have your ACTH measured if you haven't already. Ask your doctor, get with your doc and talk to them about measuring ACTH. ACTH stands for adrenocorticotropic hormone. It's the hormone from your brain that tells your adrenal glands to produce cortisol. So you can have a malfunction here, but you can also have an inability to produce adequate quantities of cortisol because you don't have the base ingredients that goes into producing cortisol. And one of those base ingredients, very importantly, again, is vitamin B5. So in trying to help you make sense of some of this. So going back to the symptoms. So after talking about all that, right, symptoms, we said premature gray hair, but one of the other symptoms is the inability to cope with stress. And so if you're not coping with stress very well, if you found that at one point in your life you could really handle a lot more stress than what you're capable of handling today, that might be a sign that your vitamin B5 levels aren't adequate. So inability to cope with stress, and again, this is one of the reasons why. Anti-stress hormone, the anti-stress factor, you need B5 to produce cortisol. Cortisol is your fire truck. So we go every day with inflammation. Everybody in the world has a level of inflammation in their body at any given moment in time. So it's not inflammation that's evil. It's the inability to regulate how aggressive that inflammation sets in and how it goes away. And vitamin B5 production of cortisol is one of those mechanisms, and that's why this symptom can manifest. Now, additionally, we might see somebody, and I know this is kind of a generic symptom because a lot of people struggle with fatigue, and there are thousands of different causes for fatigue, but fatigue is definitely a symptom of vitamin B5 deficiency, lack of focus. So lack of, think of it as lack of brain focus. Some people call that fog, right? Or brain fog itself can be a symptom of vitamin B5 deficiency. Now, one of the hallmark classic symptoms, and I talked a little bit about this in the crash course on nutrients and neuropathy, is burning foot neuropathy. And this is where the feet burn. It's called a burning neuropathy, but it's very, very common and classic to see vitamin B5 deficiency create this type of problem. Now, I do want to back up on this premature gray hair for just a minute. I know many of you may be looking at, okay, my hair turned gray early, and so now you're going to go rifle down, bottle after bottle of vitamin B5. Here's what we know. I just want to be clear. We can see premature graying of the hair, but taking more B5, there's no clinical research that shows that. Now, here's what I have seen in my own experience with people coming to see me, is if their hair is turning gray prematurely or it's accelerated graying, B5 doesn't necessarily reverse the graying that's already occurred, but it does stop the aggressive graying in many cases. So I want to be clear that, if you've got gray hair and you think you're going to go buy a bottle of vitamin B5 and reverse your gray hair and have a normal, whatever your color of hair is back, it's probably not going to happen. I just don't want to give any of you a false perception or misconception that taking B5 is somehow going to reverse the gray hair that you already have. Not something I've seen, although I've seen it slow it down in people who are starting to turn gray if we put them on vitamin B5, especially when they're deficient. We see that process really, really slow down and basically start to regulate out again. So these are your classic kind of symptoms of vitamin B5 deficiency: premature gray hair, inability to cope with stress. These are probably two of the kind of big ones. And then fatigue is a little bit more generic. Brain fog is a little bit more generic because there's a lot of different causes for these. And then the classic here, the burning foot neuropathy. If you've got that, there's a very, very strong possibility that you have a vitamin B5 deficiency. Now, as I said earlier, a lot of people don't believe in vitamin B5 deficiency. A lot of our healthcare providers and community don't believe in vitamin B5 deficiency. And I think one of the reasons why they don't believe in it is because, not that it doesn't exist, but no one tests for it. if you never test for it, you don't really see it. So you can say that it doesn't exist. I test for it in everybody who walks through the door, and I see it as a very, very common scenario, especially in people who have chronic inflammatory problems and they're under tremendous stress from the illness and from the medications that they're on. It's a tremendous amount of stress. Hey, and if you missed the earlier part of this series, click right here so you can go back and get caught up. The information there might be critical to helping you on your path to better health. And as always, thanks for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe for updates below. Have a great day.